A 9-year-old boy walked into court and said 5 words that changed everything. Watch until the end to see the truth unfold. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses down on every breath, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional squeak of leather chairs. Judge William Harrison sat at the bench, scanning a stack of documents with his usual detached focus. Across the room, attorneys in expensive suits whispered to one another, while their client, Robert Wellington III, sipped coffee with the confidence of a man used to getting everything he wanted. Janet Thompson sat quietly beside her court-appointed representative, hands clenched in her lap. She was tired, her eyes ringed with sleepless nights. She had been fighting this battle for months, trying to hold on to the only thing that mattered, her son. She worked 60 hours a week as a nursing assistant just to pay rent and buy food. She had never asked Robert for anything. In fact, he had rarely been present at all. Yet here he was now, demanding custody. Then, from the other side of the table, the unexpected happened. A chair scraped against the floor, loud and sharp in the still air. All eyes turned as 9-year-old David Thompson stood. His small frame looked even thinner against the formality of the room, his glasses sliding down his nose. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if he might sit back down, overwhelmed by the stares. But he didn't. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. "I am my mother's lawyer," David said. The words landed like a thunderclap. Judge Harrison froze, his hand hovering over his gavel. He looked up over his glasses, studying the boy as though unsure he had heard correctly. On the other side of the room, Robert Wellington choked slightly on his coffee, coughing into his handkerchief. His 2 attorneys blinked, exchanging confused glances as if waiting for someone else to intervene. "Excuse me, young man," the judge said finally, his tone cautious but firm. "This is a legal hearing between adults." "I understand, Your Honor," David replied, his voice calm and steady, far steadier than his mother's ever was under such pressure. "But I also know that under Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by the United States, I have the right to express my opinion on matters that directly affect me. And this case affects me more than anyone else in this room." He opened the notebook clutched in his hands, a spiral-bound school notebook filled with scribbles, notes, and highlighted passages. The sight of a child flipping through handwritten pages in a courtroom meant for professionals left many adults shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Robert leaned toward his lead attorney, Dr. Alan Mitchell, and muttered something urgent under his breath. Mitchell adjusted his tie and rose to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child has no legal capacity to—" David's clear voice interrupted him. "And if you really cared about my well-being, you would want to hear what I have to say, rather than trying to silence me." The words were so simple, so logical, that the room went still again. Even Judge Harrison, with decades of experience, found himself studying the boy with a mix of curiosity and caution. Janet's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea her son had been preparing for this. For weeks she had noticed him carrying home books from the library, law books, guides on children's rights, even case studies. She had thought it was just curiosity from a gifted child. She had never imagined he was rehearsing for this very moment. Robert Wellington shifted in his seat. His polished shoes tapped against the floor, betraying a nervousness he rarely displayed. He had come armed with wealth, power, and the best attorneys money could buy. What he had not prepared for was a 9-year-old standing in his path with the determination of a seasoned advocate. "David," Janet whispered softly, leaning toward him, "maybe we should let the lawyers—" "What lawyers, Mom?" David interrupted gently, though his tone carried an edge of steel. "We don't have the kind of money Mr. Wellington has. Either I speak for us, or no one speaks." The boy adjusted his glasses again, that small, deliberate movement becoming a kind of trademark in the unfolding drama. His calmness unnerved Robert. "Son," Robert began, attempting a warm tone, "I know this must be confusing for you." David turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "Don't call me son." The chill in his voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. A hush fell over the gallery. "In the last 9 years of my life, you've shown up exactly 4 times," David continued, his words deliberate and precise. "Twice on birthdays, always late. Once on Christmas, when you had 20 minutes free between parties. And once when the local press wanted a photo of you with a child for a charity story. That's not what a father is." Robert's face tightened, his jaw working. He tried to protest, but no words came. David turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I know this isn't how things are usually done, but if no one speaks for me, then I will. I've prepared a statement, I have facts, and I think this court should hear them." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. He had presided over hundreds of custody battles, each one messy and painful in its own way. But never had he seen a child step forward with such clarity, such quiet authority. He nodded slowly. "Very well, David. You may proceed." The boy closed his notebook with a soft snap, letting the sound settle in the silence of the room. He met his father's gaze for the first time, and for the first time, Robert Wellington felt something he had never expected to feel in a courtroom: fear. David spoke again, his voice even and controlled. "I will explain why I should remain with my mother. And I will explain what my father's true motives really are." The attorney stiffened. Robert's expression faltered. Janet's heart pounded in her chest, caught between awe and terror. And as the judge leaned forward, curiosity piqued, the entire courtroom braced itself. They all knew instinctively what this child was about to reveal would shake the foundation of the case and turn the balance of power upside down. David had only just begun. The evidence he carried in his school notebook was about to expose truths no one had expected. A revelation not about custody, but about greed, money, and the motives of a man who called himself a father. David opened his notebook again with the deliberate calmness of someone much older than 9. The courtroom watched him, their collective silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner above. He turned a few pages, filled with handwritten notes, copied passages, and underlined sections. His voice remained steady, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, before we talk about custody, I think it's important to establish a simple fact. In 9 years, Robert Wellington has not been a father to me." Janet flinched at the bluntness of her son's words, but she didn't stop him. There was no stopping him now. David continued, each sentence like a carefully measured step. "My father appeared 4 times in my life. 2 birthdays, 1 Christmas, 1 photo for the press. That's it. For everything else, school events, doctor visits, nights when my mom worked double shifts, I only had her. Now, suddenly, he claims to care about my future. I don't believe it, and I can show this court why." Robert shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened as Dr. Mitchell whispered rapidly in his ear, but David pressed forward. "6 months ago," David said, flipping to a marked page, "he came to our apartment. He stayed for 15 minutes. In those 15 minutes, he criticized our furniture, complained about the smell of medicine from my mom's hospital job, and told me that maybe I had potential if I received a proper education. 2 weeks later, he filed for custody. That timing doesn't sound like love to me. It sounds like calculation. The words were simple, but they struck hard. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. Judge Harrison's brow furrowed, intrigued despite himself. "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell interrupted smoothly, "my client is seeking custody because he is genuinely concerned about his son's welfare. Miss Thompson works long hours. She cannot provide the educational and social opportunities a gifted child like David deserves." David didn't even look up. He flipped to another page in his notebook. "Genuine concern? Let's examine that. In the past year and a half, Mr. Wellington has faced 3 major lawsuits. He lost a $2.3 million dispute with his former partners. His third wife filed for divorce, claiming financial dishonesty. And then there's something even more relevant: a trust fund created by my late grandmother, Eleanor Wellington." At the mention of the trust fund, Robert stiffened. His lawyers' faces blanched. Janet's head snapped toward her son in shock. She had never heard about this before. David paused for effect, then continued. "When my grandmother discovered she had a grandson, she set aside $1.7 million for my care and education, but she included a condition. The money would be released only if my father showed genuine commitment by gaining custody. If not, I would receive the funds directly at age 18 without his involvement." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Robert shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "This custody case isn't about my education or my well-being," David said, his voice gaining quiet strength. "It's about money. For 9 years, Mr. Wellington ignored me. But when he faced lawsuits, divorce, and financial loss, suddenly he wanted to be my father. Coincidence? I don't think so." Judge Harrison leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He had seen greed wrapped in the language of concern before, but rarely so clearly presented by a child. "David," he said, "you're making serious claims. Where did you learn this information?" "Public records, Your Honor," David replied without hesitation. "Court filings, newspaper archives, and corporate documents I spent every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon at the public library. Miss Rodriguez, the head librarian, showed me how to use legal databases. Every fact I just presented is public information." The judge exhaled slowly, visibly impressed. Dr. Mitchell rose quickly, his tone sharp. "This is absurd. A 9-year-old cannot possibly understand the complexities of corporate law or family trusts." David looked up at him, adjusting his glasses with a steady hand. "Maybe not every detail, but I can understand patterns. And I can understand when someone who never cared about me suddenly decides to fight for custody the moment he needs money. That doesn't take a lawyer. That just takes paying attention." Robert's face flushed. He leaned forward. "David, I'm your father. You don't understand how the world works." "No." David cut him off, his voice cold. "I understand exactly how the world works. You think money solves everything, but money doesn't make you a parent." The gallery stirred. Janet pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, torn between fear for her son and awe at his courage. David turned another page. "Your Honor, I don't believe Mr. Wellington's motives are about my best interests. I believe they're about accessing my trust fund. If he cared about my life, he would have been there all along. But the truth is simple. He wasn't. He only came now when it benefits him." Judge Harrison tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence David, but to steady the rising emotions in the room. He studied the boy for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Robert. The contrast was undeniable. The desperate, sweating businessman against the composed, articulate child. David closed his notebook again, letting the sound echo through the quiet courtroom. "That is why I believe my father's true motives should be examined before any decision is made." The silence that followed was heavier than before. For the first time in his career, Judge Harrison found himself reconsidering the structure of a custody case entirely because of the words of a 9-year-old. Across the room, Robert Wellington clenched his fists under the table, his expensive watch catching the light. He had expected an easy victory, a simple legal maneuver. Instead, he faced something he had never truly prepared for, his own son's determination. The courtroom had heard accusations, motives, and cold truths, but David wasn't finished. The next step wasn't just about words, it was about proof. And the evidence he carried would do more than expose Robert's greed. It would strike at the very foundation of his empire. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut. David's calm voice and his deliberate gestures, his ability to pierce through layers of polished arguments, none of it fit the expectations of this custody hearing. Yet here he was, a 9-year-old boy dismantling the case against his mother with precision. Robert Wellington sat stiff in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. His attorneys whispered furiously, exchanging quick glances as if searching for a strategy. But every time Dr. Mitchell rose to intervene, David answered with logic that silenced the room. Now, as the boy set his notebook aside and reached into his school backpack, the atmosphere shifted again. "I would like to present supporting documents, Your Honor," David said. From his backpack, he pulled a manila folder thicker than anyone would have expected from a child. He placed it carefully on the table, sliding out a series of stapled papers and clipped photographs. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he knew the power of timing. "These are public records from Cook County," David explained. 17 lawsuits involving Wellington Industries in the past 5 years. In each case, Mr. Wellington's company targeted families or small businesses under financial stress. In every case, the properties were acquired at prices far below market value, usually right after private information about those families' debts became known. He spread several pages before the judge. Here is one example. The Santos family, Mexican immigrants who ran a bakery. Their youngest child was hospitalized. They fell behind on payments. Within weeks, Wellington Industries acquired their property. The bakery closed. The family lost everything. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages. His expression hardened. He had seen patterns like this before in fraud hearings, but rarely in family court. Dr. Mitchell sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. These cases, even if accurate, have no bearing on a custody decision." David turned toward him with steady eyes. "It has everything to do with it, because it shows a pattern of behavior, using vulnerable families to get money. And now he is trying to do the same to us, to me." The gallery stirred, low murmurs rippling through the room. Janet sat frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other covering her mouth. She had known her son was smart. She had known he was determined. But she had never imagined him assembling evidence like this. Robert leaned forward, his voice rough with anger. "This is outrageous. He's just a child, parroting things he doesn't understand." "All from public sources," David interrupted firmly. He tapped the folder. "Court records, newspaper articles, incorporation filings, everything legal, everything accessible to any citizen, regardless of age." For a moment, Judge Harrison studied the boy again. The child's clarity, his unshaken tone, was unlike anything he had seen in decades on the bench. He looked down at the documents, then back up at Robert. "Mr. Wellington, do you wish to respond to these materials?" Robert hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at his attorneys, but their silence betrayed their uncertainty. For the first time, the man who had built his empire on intimidation and negotiation had no words. David reached into his bag again. There is one more thing, Your Honor. He lifted a small digital recorder, the kind a student might use to capture a lecture. Its black casing reflected the overhead lights. He held it with both hands, his movements precise, as though he carried something fragile and explosive. This is a recording made 6 months ago during Mr. Wellington's last visit to our apartment, David said. His voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that pulled everyone forward in their seats. He thought I was in my room doing homework, but I left the recorder on in the living room. Robert shot up from his chair. This is unacceptable. Private conversations cannot. Documented evidence is the foundation of any legal case, David interrupted, quoting something Miss Rodriguez had told him at the library. His words cut through the courtroom, firm and unyielding. Judge Harrison leaned forward. David, are you certain you wish to enter this into evidence? Yes, Your Honor, David said without hesitation. The judge gestured. Play it. David pressed a button. The faint static gave way to a familiar voice. Robert Wellington's voice, smooth yet tinged with arrogance. The sound filled the silent courtroom. Listen, Robert's recorded voice said. As soon as I get legal custody, the boy is going straight to Riverside Military Academy. It's strict. They know how to handle difficult kids. He'll stay there until he's 18, and I'll have full access to the trust funds for his education. The other side of the conversation was muffled, but Robert's voice continued clearly. Exactly. $500 a month for boarding. The rest is mine. The kid doesn't need to know about the money. It's the perfect solution. She's out of the picture. I look like a responsible father, and I control the funds. Gasps filled the courtroom. Janet's hands flew to her face, tears spilling as she listened to the cold calculation. Dr. Mitchell went pale, gripping the edge of the table. His entire argument had just collapsed in the span of 30 seconds. But David wasn't finished. He pressed the button again, fast-forwarding. The recording resumed. The problem isn't just the money, Robert's voice said, sharper now. The boy is too smart for his own good. He notices things. He asks questions. Best to keep him out of the way until he's 18. Kids like him, well, you know, they shouldn't get ideas above their station. A stunned silence followed. Robert leapt from his chair, his face red, his hands clenched into fists. This is a trap. He provoked me. He's just a child. David's voice sliced through his shouting. A child who can tell the truth. A child who refuses to be treated like a problem to be solved. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Wellington, sit down, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Robert froze, chest heaving, then slumped into his seat. David turned the recorder off and set it gently on the table. His expression remained calm, his voice quiet but unshaken. Your Honor, this is what my father really thinks of me. Not as a son, not as a child, as an obstacle standing between him and money. Judge Harrison's eyes swept the room. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Even seasoned attorneys shifted uneasily in their chairs. The evidence was undeniable. The truth had been laid bare, not by lawyers in expensive suits, but by a boy armed with determination and a public library. David closed his notebook, his small hands resting on top of it. This is why I believe the court must consider not just who has money, but who has love, because money can send me away. Love is what has kept me here. The judge did not speak immediately. He sat in silence, processing the weight of what he had just heard. Finally, he nodded once, gravely. Across the room, Robert's expensive facade was crumbling. Sweat ran down his temples. His suit clung too tightly to his shoulders, and for the first time he looked less like a powerful mogul and more like a man cornered by truth. The chapter was not over, but the outcome had shifted. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. The evidence was devastating. The documents revealed patterns of exploitation. The recording stripped away every defense Robert might have raised. Now the decision was no longer just about custody. It was about justice. And Robert Wellington's downfall had only just begun. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Judge Harrison's expression was grim, his eyes fixed not on the boy who had shaken the walls of tradition, but on the man who now sat sweating in his expensive suit. "Mr. Wellington," the judge said, his voice steady and commanding, "the evidence presented, both documents and recordings, creates a clear picture. This court cannot ignore the facts." Robert's jaw clenched. His hands tightened into fists on the table. His lawyers whispered frantically, urging him to remain calm, but his eyes burned with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For years his money had shielded him from consequences. But here, in this courtroom, a 9-year-old boy had torn that shield apart. "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell tried one final, desperate appeal. "We must not forget that my client possesses the resources to provide David with superior opportunities. Better schools, stronger connections, a path to a brighter future." The judge raised a hand. "Enough. The court does not measure parental worth by bank accounts, but by commitment and love. And what we have witnessed today demonstrates that Mr. Wellington's motives are financial, not paternal." David sat still, his small hands folded over his notebook. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply waited, knowing instinctively that every word from the bench mattered more than anything he could say. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Custody will remain with Miss Janet Thompson. Furthermore, given the nature of the evidence, I am ordering an immediate investigation into potential fraud concerning the trust fund and Wellington Industries practices." The words landed like a hammer blow. The gallery murmured, a wave of hushed voices sweeping the room. Janet gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Her entire body shook with relief as she looked at her son, who remained calm, composed, almost eerily adult in the midst of chaos. Robert exploded. "This is outrageous." He slammed his hand against the table, his voice echoing. "He's a child. He doesn't understand. This is a farce." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Wellington, one more outburst and you will be held in contempt." But Robert wasn't finished. He rose from his chair, his face red, his voice shaking with fury. "I built an empire. I gave millions in charity. And now you're all listening to a boy with a notebook." Security moved closer. The bailiffs were already on edge. David's voice cut through the uproar. "Maybe that's the point, Your Honor. Sometimes the truth is so simple a child can see it, even when adults pretend not to." The room went silent again. The words, calm and cutting, landed with the finality of a verdict. Judge Harrison struck his gavel once more. "Enough. Mr. Wellington, you will sit down or you will be escorted from this courtroom immediately." For the first time in years, Robert obeyed an order he could not buy his way out of. He dropped into his chair, his shoulders sagging, his empire visibly crumbling around him. The decision was made. The custody battle was over. Janet held her son tightly, burying her face against his hair, her tears soaking into his shirt. For the first time in months, her heart eased, the weight lifting from her chest. But outside the courtroom doors, reporters had already gathered. The moment news broke of the recording and the trust fund, the story would spread like wildfire. A real estate mogul brought low by his own greed, a child defending his mother against impossible odds. It was the kind of story that would not remain confined to legal transcripts. It would explode across the nation. And so it did. In the weeks that followed, Robert Wellington's world collapsed. His name appeared in headlines not for philanthropy or success, but for fraud, manipulation, and betrayal. The investigation launched by the court unearthed a web of unethical practices. Lawsuits multiplied, investors fled. His company, once a symbol of wealth and power, fractured and dissolved under the weight of scandal. Robert lost his mansion. His third wife finalized her divorce. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. By the time federal investigators finished, he had not only lost custody of his son, he had lost everything. Meanwhile, Janet's life began to shift. No longer living under the shadow of uncertainty, she walked with her head higher. Her colleagues at the hospital embraced her as a symbol of resilience. She wasn't just a mother who fought for her son. She was the woman whose child had exposed corruption that even seasoned attorneys had missed. But the real transformation was seen in David. To the world, he was a 9-year-old who had done the impossible. To Janet, he was still her boy, the one who read too many books, who stayed up late scribbling notes, who carried the weight of their future on his narrow shoulders. On the day Robert Wellington was formally charged with attempted fraud, Janet found David sitting at the kitchen table with his notebook again. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry all of this alone anymore," she whispered. David looked up at her, his expression calm, almost solemn. "I know, Mom, but if I hadn't spoken, no one would have listened. Sometimes kids have to be louder than the silence adults leave behind." Her tears came again, not from fear this time, but from pride. She hugged him tightly, holding on as if to anchor him in her arms, knowing the world would try to pull him in directions far beyond his years. And across the city, in a small, dimly lit apartment, rented on borrowed money, Robert Wellington stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. He was no longer the mogul, no longer the man with power. He was just another name stained by greed. The boy he had dismissed as insignificant had destroyed him. For Robert, it was the end of a reign. For David and Janet, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one not defined by money, but by freedom, resilience, and love. The court battle was won, and Robert had fallen, but what began as a fight for custody would soon grow into something much larger. For David, this was only the start of a journey that would turn him into a symbol far beyond one family's story. His voice had been heard in court. Soon it would echo across the nation. 3 years passed after that unforgettable day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The memory of a boy standing up with nothing but a notebook and his determination had not faded. In fact, it had grown into something larger than anyone could have predicted. David Thompson was no longer the quiet 9-year-old who nervously adjusted his glasses while confronting a millionaire father. At 12, he had grown taller, his face more defined, but the calmness in his eyes remained the same. To millions of Americans, he wasn't just David. He was the boy who changed the system. It started with the recording. News outlets replayed it endlessly. The cold voice of Robert Wellington describing his own son as a problem to be hidden away. The clip went viral, shared across every platform, and within weeks, David had become a national symbol. What had begun as a custody case transformed into a conversation about children's rights, parental accountability, and the weight of truth. Janet, once invisible in her long shifts at the hospital, now walked through the corridors with her head held higher. Colleagues congratulated her not just for surviving the battle, but for raising a child who had done the impossible. The hospital administration, inspired by her story, created the Janet Thompson Scholarship Fund. dedicated to children of low-income workers. Her name became synonymous with resilience and care. David's own mission had grown too. What he had learned in the public library with Miss Rodriguez, he now wanted to give to others. With help from donors inspired by his story, he launched a project called Every Child Has a Voice. Libraries across the country began setting aside sections with simplified legal resources for children and families. In more than 1,000 branches, shelves filled with colorful, easy-to-read guides on rights and responsibilities appeared, resources that had, but outside the courtroom doors, reporters had already gathered. The moment news broke of the recording and the trust fund, the story would spread like wildfire. A real estate mogul brought low by his own greed, a child defending his mother against impossible odds. It was the kind of story that would not remain confined to legal transcripts. It would explode across the nation. And so it did. In the weeks that followed, Robert Wellington's world collapsed. His name appeared in headlines, not for philanthropy or success, but for fraud, manipulation, and betrayal. The investigation launched by the court unearthed a web of unethical practices. Lawsuits multiplied, investors fled. His company, once a symbol of wealth and power, fractured and dissolved under the weight of scandal. Robert lost his mansion. His third wife finalized her divorce. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. By the time federal investigators finished, he had not only lost custody of his son, he had lost everything. Meanwhile, Janet's life began to shift. No longer living under the shadow of uncertainty, she walked with her head higher. Her colleagues at the hospital embraced her as a symbol of resilience. She wasn't just a mother who fought for her son. She was the woman whose child had exposed corruption that even seasoned attorneys had missed. But the real transformation was seen in David. To the world, he was a 9-year-old who had done the impossible. To Janet, he was still her boy, the one who read too many books, who stayed up late scribbling notes, who carried the weight of their future on his narrow shoulders. On the day Robert Wellington was formally charged with attempted fraud, Janet found David sitting at the kitchen table with his notebook again. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry all of this alone anymore," she whispered. David looked up at her, his expression calm, almost solemn. "I know, Mom, but if I hadn't spoken, no one would have listened. Sometimes kids have to be louder than the silence adults leave behind." Her tears came again, not from fear this time, but from pride. She hugged him tightly, holding on as if to anchor him in her arms, knowing the world would try to pull him in directions far beyond his years. And across the city, in a small, dimly lit apartment rented on borrowed money, Robert Wellington stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. He was no longer the mogul, no longer the man with power. He was just another name stained by greed. The boy he had dismissed as insignificant had destroyed him. For Robert, it was the end of a reign. For David and Janet, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one not defined by money, but by freedom, resilience, and love. The court battle was won, and Robert had fallen. But what began as a fight for custody would soon grow into something much larger. For David, this was only the start of a journey that would turn him into a symbol far beyond one family's story. His voice had been heard in court. Soon it would echo across the nation. 3 years passed after that unforgettable day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The memory of a boy standing up with nothing but a notebook and his determination had not faded. In fact, it had grown into something larger than anyone could have predicted. David Thompson was no longer the quiet 9-year-old who nervously adjusted his glasses while confronting a millionaire father. At 12, he had grown taller, his face more defined, but the calmness in his eyes remained the same. To millions of Americans, he wasn't just David, he was the boy who changed the system. It started with the recording. News outlets replayed it endlessly, the cold voice of Robert Wellington describing his own son as a problem to be hidden away. The clip went viral, shared across every platform, and within weeks, David had become a national symbol. What had begun as a custody case transformed into a conversation about children's rights, parental accountability, and the weight of truth. Janet, once invisible in her long shifts at the hospital, now walked through the corridors with her head held higher. Colleagues congratulated her not just for surviving the battle, but for raising a child who had done the impossible. The hospital administration, inspired by her story, created the Janet Thompson Scholarship Fund, dedicated to children of low-income workers. Her name became synonymous with resilience and care. David's own mission had grown too. What he had learned in the public library with Miss Rodriguez, he now wanted to give to others. With help from donors inspired by his story, he launched a project called Every Child Has a Voice. Libraries across the country began setting aside sections with simplified legal resources for children and families. In more than 1,000 branches, shelves filled with colorful, easy-to-read guides on rights and responsibilities appeared, resources that had never been there before. Schools invited him to speak. Standing before students his own age, David would adjust his glasses, a gesture now iconic, and tell them, "You're never too young to be heard. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words carried the weight of lived truth, and children listened. Letters poured in from across the nation, stories of boys and girls who had spoken up in classrooms and homes and community meetings, inspired by David's courage. Meanwhile, Robert Wellington's name disappeared from the list of Chicago's elite. His company, once powerful, was dismantled after a series of lawsuits. He lost his fortune, his mansion, and his reputation. After serving a prison sentence for fraud, he lived quietly in a small apartment, working jobs far below the status he once flaunted. The man who had once worn $1,000 suits now folded shirts in the back of a retail store. Yet, what stung him most wasn't the fall itself, it was the way his son never spoke about him with hatred. When reporters asked David about his father, he never mocked him, never cursed his name. He always answered the same way, "I hope he finds peace." But love cannot be bought. A father is not someone who takes, but someone who gives. For Robert, those words cut deeper than prison walls ever could. At 12 years old, David sat on a brightly lit stage, interviewed on national television. The host introduced him as the smartest kid in America, but David smiled and shook his head. "I'm not the smartest kid," he said. "I'm just a kid who refused to be silent." The audience erupted in applause. Janet, watching from the side of the stage in her hospital uniform, wiped away tears. She had never sought fame, but seeing her son inspire so many filled her with pride greater than any promotion or award. David lifted a small box filled with letters sent from children across the country. He read one aloud, written by a 10-year-old girl in Los Angeles. "Thank you for teaching me that every child has a voice. I used mine, and I saved my family from losing our home." The crowd fell silent, touched by the simplicity and power of the words. David closed the letter carefully and looked directly into the camera. "My advice to kids everywhere is this: you're not powerless. You're not invisible. Even when the world tries to ignore you, your truth matters. And sometimes that truth can change everything." Backstage, Janet hugged him tightly. "You've done more in 3 years than most people do in a lifetime," she whispered. David smiled softly. "I just did what I had to do, and now it's everyone else's turn. Months later, a letter arrived from Harvard University. They offered David a place in a special scholarship program for law and social justice, designed for exceptional young leaders. At 12, he couldn't attend yet, but the letter was a promise the path was open. He read it aloud to his mother at their kitchen table, the same place where he had once spread out piles of legal documents and scribbled notes. "I'll go," he said, "but not for me, for every child who doesn't know they have rights, for every mother who feels powerless. I want to make sure no one ever has to fight the way we did." Janet reached across the table, taking his hand. "You've already changed the world, David, but if you want to keep going, I'll be right here beside you." Years later, his legacy would continue to grow. But even now, at 12, David Thompson had already proven something extraordinary. That courage does not depend on age, that love is stronger than money, and that sometimes the smallest voices can make the loudest echoes. In a quiet moment after his television interview, as the cameras turned off and the applause faded, David whispered to himself, almost as if to remember the beginning, "I am my mother's lawyer." The words had once shocked a courtroom. Now they had transformed a nation. This story proves that even the smallest voice can change everything. If it touched your heart, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments.